To discuss the latest developments, I'm joined now by Maupin, a political analyst and journalist. Mr. Maupin, thank you for joining us. There's definitely a history of certain U.S. officials working together with certain forces there in Syria. Now they're saying they're having trouble recruiting rebels to fight against Islamic State. Why is that, do you think?
Well, these remarks from Mr. Carter about being concerned about the ideology of the people they're recruiting are almost laughable, because for the last 5 years in Syria and in Libya prior to that, the U.S. has had a policy of recruiting the most extreme elements you can imagine. The al-Nusra Front, al-Qaeda in Syria, these groups have been happily working with the U.S. toward the end of toppling the Syrian government. So the U.S. has no problem working with extremists and deranged psychopaths like you see in ISIS. But now the U.S. Is saying that they're having trouble finding people who are fighting ISIS. I mean, the whole situation is just laughable, and it really shows the U.S. really doesn't want to defeat ISIS. When it gets down to it, who is ISIS fighting? ISIS is fighting against the Syrian government, which the U.S. government has been trying to topple for the last several decades. ISIS has been fighting against the Shia community in Iraq, which is sympathetic to Iran. Everywhere ISIS goes, whether it's in Yemen, where they're aligned with Saudi Arabia against the forces that want to fight for independence, everywhere ISIS goes, it only fights enemies of the United States, and in the process creates these gruesome videos, which then serve as a justification for expansion of the U.S. drone strike program and military presence in the region. So when it gets down to it, the U.S. has no interest in fighting ISIS. ISIS is very convenient for the Pentagon.
U.S. officials also often use this term moderate rebels. Does such a thing even exist?
Well, it's pretty obvious that if it exists, it's very, very, very marginal. The Free Syrian Army, the armed groups seeking to overthrow the Syrian government, have almost always been clearly understood to be dominated by extremist religious organizations. The term takfiri is used to describe a certain branch of Sunni Islam that justifies the slaughter of people for religious reasons. The forces that make up the Free Syrian Army have openly described their goal not as a democratic, prosperous country in Syria, but rather to create an Islamic caliphate in the country. And that's the case. But the U.S., again, has no problem aligning with these forces. It has no problem associating with extremists, whether it's in Syria, Iraq, or in Ukraine, where they're aligned with neo-Nazis. All over the world, the U.S. is happy to work with extremists. So now they're telling us, oh, that they can't find people because of ideological problems. This is just nonsense.
Why do you think does America refuse to work with Syrian authorities on this issue?
Well, again, it gets back to the fact that the Islamic State and the U.S. State Department have the same goal, which is the toppling of the Syrian Arab Republic, the overthrowing of the Syrian government. That has been the goal of the U.S. State Department for many years, and that is also the goal of the Islamic State. So why would the U.S. work with the Syrian government? I mean, that's what this is about. ISIS is not really something that the Pentagon is concerned about. It's very convenient for them. Their gruesome acts of violence are well publicized. They horrify the world with what they do, and in doing so, they justify U.S. military intervention throughout the Middle East.
Mr. Maupin, that's all the time we have for now. Thank you very much for joining us. This was Maupin, political analyst and journalist. Thank you, sir.